Welcome to Pre-Shift, Tidbits of Wisdom for Everyday Service. My name is TJ Griffin, and I'm the Corporate Wine Educator for Winebo. We welcome your questions at any point during the webinar, but please use the Q&A option rather than the chat bar to submit them. And please get your questions in early. This is one of the most popular searches on Google for a wine-related search, and there's bound to be a lot of questions. We'd love to answer as many as possible, so just jump right in whenever you want. Now let me introduce your host, Winebo's Director of Wine Education and 29-year hospitality veteran, Ron Edwards. He is the husband of one wife, the father of 5 girls, a surfer, missionary kid, and as you can see, a lover of all things bow tie. And now here to discuss today's topic, food and wine pairing, part 1, Master Sommelier, Ron Edwards.
Well, hello, TJ. Nice to join you again on this bi-weekly tradition we've started. Well, welcome everybody. Hoping that you have lots and lots of questions to keep us entertained today. This is it's as much an opinionated subject as we can find in wine. It's certainly a very personal subject, the way it interacts, and I'll try to share some of my own personal experience and interactions I've had with others along the way, and as well as lay down some foundational information so that you can feel more confident when you pick out either the food you want to go with the wine that you're choosing or vice versa, that you have done the right thing. And if you're working in our industry, if you're a sales rep and you get consulted by the restaurant to pull wines in for events or what have you, knowing this part of your business is really important because, you know, they trust us to come up with the right answers because they also have the questions. And I hope this will work for you in that regard as well. So that kind of brings it up to the real idea, and that is this wonderment, right? I can't tell you how many times I've had someone ask me about food and wine pairing, both in restaurant settings, just casual conversations, somebody sitting next to me on an airplane. It's the second most common question I get from someone when they find out what I do for a living. The first one is always, what's your favorite wine? Which I'd love it if people were a little more creative about that, because I don't know if they're really expecting me to ask or answer the question with my favorite winery, but champagne is my favorite wine, and I just leave it at that. And that baffles them because most of the time they're assuming I'm going to say something that's definitely red. And the other is, I'm having such and such this weekend, or last week I had this, or I was at a restaurant and I had this food, but the wine didn't really work. What should I have ordered? Is normally the second half of that conversation. So this is definitely a topic that's really on people's minds. And I think it's also part of the American psyche that there's this idea of right and wrong in this world of food and wine pairing. We want to do things as Americans inside our culture at a really high level. And so we even want to overachieve in the idea of food and wine pairing. Whereas, you know, that's a big change for us because not too many years ago, it was the mentality was whatever was on the table with whatever was on the table, so to speak. Whatever came out of the jug next to me, as one of my master sommelier friends put it about his house, that wine in his house growing up came in 3 colors and in large vessels. So I was like, yeah, okay, I got it. White, rosé, and red, and out of jugs with twist-off caps. So we've come a long way in this country, and so we might as well push the envelope a little bit further. So let's explore this a little bit. All right, some universal principles of design, so to speak. I love this picture because that's really what it boils down to, is that, you know, as I used to lecture in the past, food and wine pairing is not a set of rules per se, but more like guidelines. It's kind of like the Pirates Code. It's these ideas have some flex in them because there's personal preference involved. There's also creativity involved, and it's not quite the same every day. As Evan Goldstein put it in his book, even in the restaurant setting where you have always paired this wine with that dish, that pairing varies from day to day. And the reason it varies is seasonality of the ingredients. The variation of cooks on the line. the saute chef from last month is gone, and there's a new saute chef who's more heavy-handed with the salt. So all of a sudden, your food and wine pairing tastes completely different. All of these things have such they're so flexible based on the reality of the moment. I've had the exact same pairing several different times in my own life and felt differently about it personally 3 different times because I was in a different place, perhaps, when I had the pairing. So these are definitely guidelines. But the things we want to make our guidelines about are the structure of the food and wine, meaning the chemistry that it's built on, the acid, the tannin, the sugar, the protein, all that stuff. That's the structure, right? Then the other principle we want to keep in mind is texture. The textural relationship between food and wine is hugely important. And a great structural comparison, you may have done all the right things in the structure where you got the acid right and you got the adjustment for fat right and all that stuff, but you miss the texture and all of a sudden it's just okay. And then there's a temperature issue. Is your food hot temperature-wise? Is it cold temperature-wise? Is it room temperature? And what wine is going to work with that? Soup is a huge issue there. We'll talk about it later. And last, but certainly not least, is the culture in which you're serving. And who is your guest at the time? Because each person comes to your table, comes to your pairing with an inherent culture of their own, whether that be ethnic culture or whether it is more of a socioeconomic culture, or is it is this a business dinner as opposed to, all of that culture has to be considered when we're dealing with food and wine pairing.
So Ron, you talked a little bit about it first about, a good and bad thing. And I think that there's been a backlash of sorts against that. And, you hear some people saying none of this stuff really matters. What you just talked about is very complicated. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, none of this stuff matters. Just drink what you like. Is that, you think that's oversimplifying things?
Well, I think that you should drink what you like. And certainly at our house, we don't have, as much as some people are surprised by this, I don't have a wine cellar with, hundreds of choices to go down and say, oh, tonight is roasted chicken. I'll go find the exact right wine with that. We tend to have a lot of white wine in the house because my wife and I kind of prefer that over red most of the time. And whatever we open that day is what ends up with dinner. I tend to try and pair it up on Fridays, and wine is more flexible than a really rigid, old school image of the sommelier deciding on things would allow, because it is an acidic beverage. Even when we say it's a low acid wine, it does have properties that make it work with food anyway. And you can often find that, it was fine together. TJ, it was like you kind of leave their impression of this moment in time was like, it was fine. But that's not great food and wine pairing. That's acquiescing, right? That's living in the moment and going, yeah, whatever. What I'm talking about is when you are given the opportunity to do it right, because the people on the other side of the equation are looking for that. This is where you go. But I agree with the principle of let the guest decide how important this is to them, because some people are really going to live in what you just said. I drink what I like. I eat what I eat. You don't want to mess with that too much because you'll make them unhappy in just a couple of sentences. Because when we get into the conversation with them about food and wine pairing and they're having, I don't know, halibut and they want to drink Cabernet Sauvignon and my brain goes, that's not going to work together. If I bring that up, all I can do is insult them, right? So we have to play this. We have to play these cards based on our audience. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. One question down. All right, so let's talk about acidity. By the way, in the dining room, we don't really talk about acidity because most people react negatively to the word acidity. But if you think about the picture in front of you, that is a very acidic fruit, right? Those limes are pretty acidic. But we talk about tartness with guests. We don't use the word sour because sour is also a negative impression. We talk about tartness. And sometimes we have to make real world approximations with them, right? We like tart beverages. We like lemonade. We like lemon in our iced tea. We like lemon in our water. So we don't have a problem with tartness as humans, but it's how we label it. But when we're talking back behind the scenes, we're talking about acidity. And acidity in wine is exactly that. It's tartaric acid, it's citric acid, and a couple of other things all combined together to give you the tartness of the wine. Now, what we're really tasting when we taste tartness is its pH. It's that logarithmic scale that goes from base to acidity. And the lower the number, the more acidic it is, the further away from being neutral. And so wine, even wine that we say has low acidity, is probably in that pH of 4, where neutral is 6.5. TJ, I'm suddenly forgetting my chemistry. If you can help me out with it, that's great. But then there's wines like, I don't know, Czar Valley Riesling, where your final wine pH is like 2.8. Great champagnes of the world that are laid down for a long time will often have a pH of like 2.6 or 2.7. And the difference between that and 4 is like the difference between biting into a lemon and having a lemon drop candy. That's a big difference in how it hits you on the palate. So when we talk about foods are not always naturally acidic. We tend to add acid to foods. And so the classic things that are all about acidity are things like tomato sauces. We think about them not necessarily as tart, but if you have, the sensitivity to heartburn and you have tomato sauce, you go, oh yeah, that was acidic, right? And things like a lot of our sauces, white wine butter sauce, right? Normally has citrus in it, normally has reduced white wine. Those two things add acidity. Citrus beurre blanc, those kind of things. It is a very regular inclusion into food because acid is one of the things, like salt, that makes food taste better. One of the common ingredients to be added to food by chefs to bring up acidity and make flavor pop is vinegar, both balsamic and regular vinegar. But that's a whole different kind of acidity. That's acetic acid, and that one's really hard on wine. So what's our basic principle here? Our basic principle is that in order for the wine not to fall flat, meaning taste fruitless or taste sort of edgy or even metallic, the acidity in the wine needs to be at least as high as the acidity in the food. So if you have a low acid dish, you're in magic land because any wine you pick out is going to be okay. Let's throw an example of that. How about sherry with, the classic sardines and things like that are in the tapas menus? It's salty, it's oily. Well, Fino sherry is one of the lowest acid wines on the planet Earth because actually the process of making sherry, that Saccharomyces ingests acidity and lowers it even further than it was when it went into the process. And yet those foods taste great together. Why? Because we're really not dealing with acid on acid. We're dealing with salt and umami and that sort of richness with the alcohol. But if you take Chev cheese and you try to eat Chev cheese with a wine that is 4.0 on the pH, the wine is going to taste like the fruit disappeared or might even taste thin and metallic. Translate that forward to what's the most natural thought with Chev cheese, TJ?
Loire Sauvignon Blanc.
Loire Sauvignon Blanc. Why? What grows together goes together. That's a very easy thing, right? So goat's cheese is a fairly high acid cheese. It's tart. And Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire Valley is an elevated acidity wine. So they work together for at least that one reason. Is that making sense so far?
Yes. So acidity on acidity, can that be a problem? Can you have too much acidity if you are pairing acidic wines with acidic dishes?
That is the weird thing, is that when you combine them at the right level, you would think they multiply. But what actually happens is they sort of cancel each other out. So the tartness, your palate doesn't perceive the tartness of either anymore, and it moves on to the fruit base of the wine and the other flavors in the dish. It's very interesting how that works. And there's some other things that acidity loves and maybe doesn't love, and we need to explore that a little bit here. And that is that acidity loves oils. In other words, unsaturated fat, the fat items that are liquid at room temperature. So olive oils and fish oils and things like that. Acidity really likes those. It combines with them, takes them out of the picture, and allows you to taste other things. And there's some logic behind this, right? I mean, it's not that the lemon was squeezed on fish originally to lower oils. It was originally squeezed on fish to sort of hide the fact that the fish wasn't that fresh. But that natural combination is easy to see when you think about oily dishes, not fatty dishes. Those are very different. Clarified butter and lobster doesn't want tannin, it wants acidity. And the other is that the acidity in the wine will pop the flavors in the food or even counteract some things. Like the acidity in wine will lower your impression of saltiness in the dish. So that going back to that same thing about why champagne and potato chips, why are those so great together? Well, the potato chip has absorbed some of the oils that it was cooked in, and it is covered in salt. And the champagne is both effervescent to wash flavor away and has a low pH or high acidity, which washes away the oil and combines beautifully with the salt. And there you go, champagne and potato chips, magic. But there is one thing to look out for, and that is easily perceived in a blind tasting, especially with folks who haven't had a lot of experience with it. They will almost always confuse the level of the acidity and the level of the tannin in a red wine, because acidity accentuates tannin. It makes it more obvious. So if you have, or bitterness more to the point. So if you have a bittering element in food, let's say there's bitter chocolate in the sauce or whatever, acidity can make that feel a little more bitter. So you have to kind of watch out for that in a really detailed pairing scenario. Let's move on to tannin, as a matter of fact. TJ, you have any input at this point? Or
just to answer your question from earlier, so 7 is the midpoint on the pH scale, but I think neutral for a wine lover might be indeed 6 or even 5.
Yeah, I mean, because honestly, that sort of target of 4.0 in a lot of New World regions for red wines is to make it feel lush and not tart. So I would think it's probably pretty close to 4 when you start to think, wow, this wine isn't tart at all. So let's talk about tannin. I put the bittersweet chocolate image up here because it's bitter. And tannin as a component of wine is bitter. So this is really more about the wine than it is the food. And what does that bittering element in the wine, which is the same bittering element that you would find in black teas, the tea leaf dissolved, it's the same bittering element as coffee and a few other things out there. That is not a flavor profile that humans naturally gravitate towards. And I think that this is sort of in our survival biology, is that things that are bitter are for the most part bad for you. A lot of the natural poisons that occur in the world, et cetera, have a bitterness to them. And so we are averse to them out of survival skills. However, some things are bitter and delicious, right? Like there are bitter greens that are awesome. And coffee I'm a big fan of, although I would say the great majority of people drinking coffee in this country are ameliorating the bitterness with something, either cream or sugar or both, or, they're going to one of our favorite coffee chains and doing some sort of caramel latte or whatever, so that the coffee bitterness is way in the background. Well, balancing out wine in the winery is about making the tannin fit with everything else. But there are some grapes out there that the tannin will always come forward. And when it's made in a normal style, Cabernet Sauvignon is one of those. Nebbiolo is certainly one of those. Sangiovese is certainly one of those. And then we have to figure out, all right, what do we need to do with that on the table so that the person enjoying the wine enjoys the wine more and the dish tastes better too because of it. So the big thing with tannin is going to attach itself to you, or it's going to attach itself to saturated fat, that fat that is solid at room temperature, the fat that's between the layers of protein in the meat, of red meat, that sort of fat. So if we are going to turn that intense Panzer tank of a Barolo into this warm and fuzzy wow, there's fruit here and herbs and sandalwood and all the crazy stuff that comes out of a glass of Barolo. With time and air, we're going to need to engage that wine with something that's fat driven, which is where we get into this idea of, braised veal shank or risotto, that classic Piedmontese risotto. Where's the fat in that dish? It's not the rice that's the issue. It's the Parmesan cheese used to absorb the tannin in that case. And then after that, it's texture. Yes, the rice takes some of the tannin, but it's really about the fat that's folded in to the risotto at the end. And then all of a sudden, this wine that is like an assault on the palate becomes a cleansing act for the dish, and all of the fruit and the other stuff come forward for the guest. And we have this magic that happens with great pairing. That's the reason that California Cabernet and Bordeaux work so great in a steakhouse. All that red meat, from lamb to beef, all works really well with tannic red wine. Now, there's a couple of things. This old idea, TJ, I know we've all heard and sometimes even lived by: white wine with fish, red wine with meat, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, excuse me, that's not necessarily true. You can have red wine with fish, but you have to be cognizant of what you're doing and you have to plan around it, because tannin in red wine, or white for that matter, tannin hates fish oils. It accentuates the fish oil and pushes it forward on the palate, and the fishiness of some fishes is really based on the idea of the oils in the fish. So if you are not trying to make something taste fishier, you're going to try to avoid tannin and you're going to try to wash those fish oils away with acidity instead. So how do you turn red wine into a fish dish? Well, first of all, you go find red wine that is low in tannin. Things like Pinot Noir and Gamay are a good look, or really lightweight Sangiovese, or a few other things where you're taking the a tartness of a red wine and supplanting what would be a tannic finish. It's very difficult to take something like Cabernet Sauvignon or one of the high tannin grapes and turn it into a fish-oriented red wine. It takes a lot of specialized menu prep and very careful choice on what the fish is. Tannin is not tempered or ameliorated by oils. So the olive oil in the dish or clarified butter or that sort of thing, that's not really going to help you with tannin. And excuse me, remember that if you have acidity in the food, like if you have a lemon-based, here's a great example. Everything's going swimmingly well. You've got your lamb shank, you've got your risotto underneath, but then the garnish is gremolata, which is, zested lemon. Well, combined with everything on the dish, the gremolata will probably still work with your tannic red wine. But if you had a bite of the gremolata on its own and then tasted your Barolo or your Brunello di Montalcino or your Cabernet Sauvignon, all of a sudden you're going to go, wow, this wine's really angular all of a sudden and kind of mean. That's really based on the acidity coming from the lemon zest in the gremolata. It's not coming from the rest of your dish. All right. So we're ready now to deal with tannin, right?
Well, the gremolata just made me think of something, and this may be opening up a can of peas and carrots, but what about tannic wines with vegetable dishes and vegetarian fare?
That's where a challenge lies, because the vegetables in the vegetarian fare, you have to figure out a way to build in something to temper the tannin, right? Or you just live with the idea that the tannin stays there and you're going to try and combine the wine somewhere else. A lot of times people will try to temper red wines in vegetarian dishes with mushrooms. The best way to temper them in vegetarian dishes is with cheeses, hard aged cheeses, preferably not cow's milk, because cow's milk cheeses don't work as well with red wine as sheep's milk or goat's milk, but hard aged. So things like Pecorino Romano. That said, once you move into the world of vegan, now you really have nothing between you and the wine. And most vegan dishes I've found are either lightweight red wines, rosés, or white wine dishes, just by nature of the fact that you're eliminating a lot of the things that Tannin wants to latch onto. Now, that's also guest specific, right, TJ? If the person looks at me and says, "Oh, I just love Nebbiolo," then it's really not going to matter what you put in front of them with that wine, because they've got experience with that level of tannin and they're fine with it. And that's where it comes back to the idea of I drink what I drink, I eat what I eat. But yeah, that's a big obstacle in the modern world, is the number of vegetarian dishes going outdoors of the kitchen, as well as the number of vegan dishes. And I suppose to a certain degree, you can absorb some tannin with things like tofu, but it's not an easy thing. So you have to get creative, maybe with risotto style dishes. You can make risotto style dishes for vegans that don't have the cheese in it, and you just use the natural creaminess of the risotto method, and then add flavor to it. And there's quite a few very interesting plant-based meats and things like that should be exploited, because there's a fair amount of oils or oil derivatives in all of those to help hold them together and stuff like that. Sugar. TJ, what's the chef's favorite ingredient in America?
Salt?
Maybe. It's pretty much an even tie with sugar. And there's reasons for that. Sugar just makes food taste better. And we as humans really like sugar. We can talk about all the sugar we're taking out of our diets, but the reality is there's a ton of sugar in our diets, and we crave sugar as people. And it's just a variation of a level. Some people crave it more than others because they are a little addicted to it. And sometimes we crave it just because we need a quick burst of energy. But sugar is a big deal. And the modern American chef uses it on a regular basis as a foil for something else on the plate. And, and this has subsided a little bit, but I was wandering the world for quite a few years as a consultant, and in a lot of high-end restaurants, there would always be at least one dish that had this little slice of honeycomb on the plate to as a garnish. And that's great as long as you're having, German Auslese Riesling for whatever that dish was. But it's not so great if you're throwing Pinot Noir or other red wine against it. So we have to take notice as sommeliers and beverage professionals of how does our chef use sugar. They don't all use it the same way, and they don't all use it as much. I have a good friend who's actually a master sommelier and a chef, and his seasoning salt has two ingredients that you wouldn't expect: sugar and MSG. So obviously he has to reveal that. I won't give his name so he doesn't get in trouble, but he's just admitting to the world and himself as he does that this is a flavor people really like. And when I use this as my seasoning salt, people love it. So sugar is almost always around. And there's a purpose for it from the wine side and also in the food side, right? One of the really pleasurable examples of sugar in food is that classic Asian sweet spicy combination that we see in a lot of the Asian subcontinents and Thai food, et cetera, where you have like miso has some sweetness to it, and then there's some chili pepper, and it's just delicious because you get the heat and then the sweet sort of calms it, and you go back and forth that way. The other thing that sugar really helps with is saltiness. I mean, who doesn't like salted caramel? Not too many of us. It's my favorite flavor of ice cream because you get both sweet and you get saltiness at the same time. And so wine can fill that role for us right alongside. The danger zone is when there's not a sufficient buffer between the sugar that's in the food and the wine, meaning it's at a low enough level that it's really not affecting the wine, or there's a lot of other savory elements on the plate to sort of keep it in check. It just destroys the fruit base in wines. It makes them taste thin. Sometimes they just taste like metal across the palate. You have this, when you go from a completely savory dish to something that's got some sugar in it, think of barbecue sauce. Almost every barbecue sauce has sugar in it, as well as vinegar, but sugar is a major ingredient in red barbecue sauces. You have one impression of this wine before the sugar hits you, and then a completely different impression afterwards. And usually it's a lesser impression. So sugar is a huge, huge barrier or blessing, depending on what you're trying to do. So in the wine side, let's talk about how wine works that has sugar in it with food, because if we already know that our chefs are probably going to want to use sugar, then we should pull back into ourselves and go, well, all right, let's use some wines that have sugar. German Riesling, not all of it has sugar, but some of it does. Loire Valley Chenin Blanc from Vouvray, a lot of it, like the Sectandre concept, where it's, 0.8, like 8 grams per liter to maybe 11. And it really kind of tastes dry, but there's enough sugar there to sort of balance out some underlying sweetness in food. These are all great ideas. And the application of sugar is super powerful in certain genres of cooking. Asian cooking, I hate to put it all in one lump, but in general, Asian cooking has that range of salty, sweet, and spicy in some fashion or another. High acid, sweet wines work great with that. Quite a bit of our Southwestern cuisine comes with chili pepper heat. Sugar works really well with that, as well as acidity. So those are places where we can use that to our advantage. Sweet wines are not just for dessert. And sweet is a relative thing, right? It's the whole idea that the public thinks all Riesling is sweet. Well, that's not even close to true. So, but the ones they've had probably did taste sweet to them. And their variation of sweet and ours is different. So this is when real sugar exists, not when somebody calls a wine sweet because it's fruity. Those are very different things. So here's some things to play with to help you understand how sugar works with and against wine. If you have the freedom to experiment with a dish that has sugar in it, and your glass pour program, for instance, try dry red wine all the way through residual sugar whites with that same dish and see how that impression changes with you. And there will be a sweet spot with that dish as you're moving towards lots of sugar, where there's enough perceptible sweetness in the wine that it either equals or exceeds what's perceptible sweetness in the dish. And that's where the magic happens. So in the world of wine and food, the wine has to have as much or more perceptible sweetness as the dish you're serving it with in order for the wine not to fall off or go completely flat. And that is where the challenge lies, because our guests sit down in our dining rooms and they think a special evening is this kind of wine, whatever's in their mind, right? Most of them, it's not residual sugar wine. And the food demands something different. So just keep that in mind. There was a point in time where I worked with a chef who liked to use sugar, and I sold more Gruner Veltliner and Riesling in that restaurant than I ever have since. And nobody did, or after he left, just because the way he cooked needed that sort of style. And that's sugar.
Ron, is there a perception that people who like sweeter wines have to be educated, that they're you'll learn to like this, you'll learn to like that? I love a lot of different styles of wine, but I love sweet wines, and I find that that notion bothersome, but it's out there.
Oh, it's totally out there. It's a leftover from a forgotten time to some of us, or we're too young to even know about it, when the beverage of choice as far as wine was concerned went along the lines of Behringer White Zinfandel. That was a huge success. It's a blush. It's a classic blush, and it has enough sugar, certainly enough sugar to notice and people like that. And it was friendly and it was easy. I mean, we drink an enormous amount of soda or pop or soda pop, whatever you want to call it in this country. But then people will say, yeah, but I drink the NutraSweet version. Well, that's just fake sugar. It's still sweetness. People love sweet beverages. For whatever reason, the arrogance of some in the wine trade have decided that you can't really be an appreciator of fine wine unless you drink dry to bone dry and what some people would consider painful wine. That is just not a good attitude. So let's not propagate that at all. There is, if your hope in the back of your mind is to expand somebody's realm of experience, I can live with that. I want you to experience more of the wine world because it's fun. That's great. But to say I need to mature you beyond sugary wines, well, that's just nonsense, because some of the greatest wines in the world are residual sugar wines. And what's happened is people have swung so far the other direction that they no longer appreciate some of the greatest wines in the world because they have sugar in them, even though they eat sugar and drink sugar and other things all the time. So yeah, we don't want to go that direction. That whole concept annoys me beyond belief. Because I also think that, 25 grams of sugar per liter in a classic German Riesling, and I'm happy. And by the way, I don't want lemonade that's just lemon and water. That's no fun to me. So, let's keep it real.
That's not even lemonade.
Nope. Well, that's just lemon and water. Yes. All right, alcohol. Alcohol is a tricky one, because in general, alcohol doesn't work with food. It just doesn't. It's more of an antagonist than anything else. The biggest risks are it multiplies spice-driven heat. So any kind of capsaicin-based heat, chili pepper, habanero, jalapeno, whatever black pepper, the alcohol in the wine is going to make that more apparent. And in return, the alcohol will feel hotter. Okay, so we got to avoid that. It's interestingly also multiplied by salt. So that duck confit that's sitting in front of you, that's been cured in salt, right, and fat, and then is served to you, is fairly naturally salty. Bacon's fairly naturally salty. And I've got Pinot Noir in front of me that I just know is going to taste good with that. And I taste it and, oh man, this isn't as good as I thought. And then I look down and it's a New World Pinot Noir at 14.5% alcohol. Okay, that's why it's not working. That exact same grape at 13.5% alcohol will work with this salty dish. So you have to pay attention to salt level in regards to the level of alcohol in the wine you're serving. So really salty dishes or things that are led by salt, like confit, like bacon, you need to dial your alcohol back to make it work. And it does have a benefit of texture, right? Because the alcohol is what forms the texture of the wine more so than most other things, except for when it goes through malolactic transformation. And so big, rich, textured dishes are the places where more alcohol is a friend of yours. But until you get to that point, it's more something you work around. One of my favorite quotes was from Keith Goldston, and he came up with it, and he said, alcohol is like judo. You got to bend with it. It's something to work around. Not often is it something to work with. And that is where we're going to end today. Next time, we're going to talk about some other stuff. So now's a great time for questions, if anyone has one.
So while the questions are coming in, question about alcohol, and you didn't say this, and I'm not trying to start any controversy, but are New World wines just less food friendly than their Old World counterparts?
It depends on I don't like to go quite that general. Elevated alcohol with lower levels of acidity are less food friendly. Because let's put that in context. I think Barolo, for instance, is a pretty food friendly wine, as long as you're talking about fairly savory and rich dishes, right? It has a realm in which it lives. And most Barolo is 14.5% alcohol, which matches up with most New World wines. But the big difference, and it has like impressively high tannin, which is not necessarily food friendly. So what's the magic balancing act there is tartness. Barolo also has low pH, high acid as a structure. So it's not so much where the wine comes from as it is the balancing act in the wine. So, if you have a 14.2% Cabernet Sauvignon out of Napa Valley, but it has a 3.6 pH, it's going to be pretty food friendly. But that same wine at 4.0 pH and 14.5 is suddenly falls flat on the table because it just doesn't have enough tartness to make the food pop, except for very specific dishes. So, but I can also go out to California, and there's some producers I know that are making, 13.8 Cabernet Sauvignon, or they're making 13.2 Pinot Noir, or they're, it's all based on what you want. Like, let's say I'm into California Chardonnay, and I'm totally good with the rich, intense styles that some people make out there. Okay, well, what am I going to have that with? How about lobster and clarified butter? How about, king crab? How about truffle whipped potatoes and anything? Because the potatoes take care of everything else. So I don't think it's new world, old world. This is really a structure argument, because there are wines in the old world that are not lending themselves well to food because of the exact same issue, right? So one of the difficult wines in the old world is like Spanish Monastrell. It's a warm climate grape. It's pretty bold and not very tart. So you have to be very careful what you put it with.
So we have a question here. How about pairing sweeter Italian wines like Vinsanto and Recioto with dessert?
I think that's a great thought, because there are places you can put them in savory, right? There's definitely applications for that. The easiest place to get people into sweet wines in the US is on cheese course. Wines with residual sugar just naturally work with a lot of different kind of cheeses, because it's a sweet and salty or a sweet and tart thing, right? So if you throw a little bit of Vinsanto, even if it's a tart goat's milk cheese, they're balancing each other out, just like lemon, water, and sugar balances out to make lemonade. There's also the idea of lighter weight style desserts. Coming back to Vinsanto again, you've got that nutty, caramelized character. Okay, well, let's go with something like an apple and walnut galette, where you have that not so intense sweetness that outweighs the sweetness of the Vinsanto, but you have a lot of the same flavor profiles put together. We just passed a great season for these kind of wines, Thanksgiving, with the sweeter elements that end up on the table, the sweet potato dishes and the pumpkin pie and all of that kind of thing. Recioto wines, like, like the Recioto wines from Valpolicella area, they have a whole new application, and they can indeed find their way onto a situation where you have a very rich, textured, savory dish that really goes great with that sort of extra texture, a little bit of extra alcohol. And then how do you make it pop? You make it pop with the side items, like we're going to talk about next week, where maybe there's dried fruit on the plate that's mixed in with the savory. Things like beef short rib that's braised and has all of that really rich texture at the end. You can make residual sugar wines work really well with that, especially some of these less well-known wines that are actually red and sweet.
Another question, and I love this question because I think that this style of wine does not get talked enough about with food and wine pairing, but sparkling wines with food. Specifically, the questions about sweet sparkling wines, but how about sparkling in general as well?
Yeah, one of my favorite pairings is border Mexican food, where you get all that cilantro pop and you get the jalapeno heat, not over the top heat, just like you notice it heat, is Moscato d'Asti or Asti Spumante. The bubbles act like acidity to wash flavor away, and the sugar calms the heat down so that you're ready for the next bite. It's a really great pairing. It's very oddball. You're not going to get people ordering it on their own, for sure. The other thing is this idea of wedding cake and champagne, right? Oh, it drives me nuts. The cake is so much sweeter than the champagne, unless you're serving a champagne with a fair amount of residual sugar, or a sparkling wine with a fair amount of residual sugar. For instance, we are really loving Prosecco in this country now. And most of the Prosecco being consumed in the United States has a noticeable amount of residual sugar. That's one of the reasons we love it, because it's really easy to like. So that's where we get those really cool appetizer type things, where it's the prosciutto wrapped cantaloupe or melon ball. It's like, oh, the sweetness of the fruit and the saltiness of the prosciutto work perfectly with that sparkling wine with sugar. So coming back to the champagne and potato chips, most standard non-vintage champagne is in that 6 to 10 grams per liter residual sugar. So there is sugar there that if you let the bubbles go away and you try the wine flat, you'll notice it. So that's where we get into the idea of salty, tasty, crunchy. And, I really love off-dry sparkling wines with salads, especially kind of that modern approach. My wife likes to put, like dried craisins or pomegranate seeds and stuff like that on the salad, along with maybe some goat's cheese. Well, by the time you put any kind of salad dressing on there, you've eliminated almost every wine except bubbly wine with a little residual sugar.
I have never had an off-dry sparkling wine with a salad, and now I want one.
Well, all right. Yeah, I'm kind of hungry myself.
Well, I think that is it for today. And that was just part one. There's a lot more to talk about, right?
Yep. And we're going to come back and we're going to put more time into texture. We're going to put a fair amount of discussion into the bits and pieces that make the bridge for wine and food pairing. In other words, sauces and side items. And then culture. You're trying to adjust to the person that you're dealing with, or even the people groups that you're dealing with instead.
Oh, quick question just came in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to forget it for next time. Savory pairing for ports other than cheese.
Yeah, let me think about that for a bit because, here you go. And I did this with Madeira, and you could do it with port. It has to be big. It has to be powerful food texturally, and it has to be rich. So one of my successful pairings with Madeira, specifically Malmsey Madeira with a lot of bottle age, was bone marrow, beef bone marrow as a dish with a sauce, because that in and of itself was so rich that the wine actually felt like a release. And I think you could do something similar with port. The big issue is it can be done, but in order to do it, the dish itself has to be intense and rich and textured. And you have to avoid all spice, because any kind of pepper is just going to make the port taste like somebody put a firecracker in your mouth and lit it.
Right. All right. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Please join us next time for part two in 2 weeks on December 15th at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll be almost up to Christmas at that point, Ron.
Yep. And then we're going to take a break and let Christmas happen and come back in January after that.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.